On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
So that is Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell addressing a criminal indictment because of testimony he gave back in June about a multi-year project to renovate those Federal Reserve buildings. Powell has repeatedly faced some pretty sharp criticism from President Donald Trump and members of his party because of his refusal to lower interest rates. This morning, CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand asked the director of National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, if this investigation would undermine what has always been time immemorial as an independent Fed. Here's what he had to say.
I guess the question is, if you think the building costs $20 billion or $10 billion, do you think at some point that it's appropriate for the federal government to investigate? And seems like the Justice Department has decided that they want to see what's going on over there with this building that's, massively more expensive than any building in the history of Washington. And if I were Fed chair, I would want them to do that. I think that it's really important to understand where the taxpayer money goes and to understand why it goes this way or that.
All right, so Kevin Hassett there. So let's break this apart with CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, what does the government have to prove here, especially with the headwinds from people like Elizabeth Warren who say this is about politics?
So the government would have to prove that this is not about politics, or put another way, the government would have to show that there is some sort of probable cause for a federal crime here. When we're having this conversation about investigations, Reed, as you know, the thing to remember is that an investigation is very different from going to a grand jury and having the grand jury say, yes, we think there's probable cause. And even then, there's a difference between a grand jury saying there's probable cause for a crime and a conviction. And so we're at the very beginning of something that may actually never turn into a federal case. We're at a probe. And so at this point, what we're looking at is what evidence is gathered if we find that out, whether or not prosecutors decide to go to a grand jury, and what they ask for if they do hypothetically go to a grand jury, what they ask for Powell or someone else to be indicted for. Again, saying we don't like what you're doing, or this is too expensive, or we think that this was mismanaged. All of those things are different from saying we think a federal crime was committed.
Oftentimes, you and I talk about these things after they've gone through that grand jury process. So if this is being released and talked about and discussed by people like you and me before that, doesn't that sort of undercut the government saying, no, this has nothing to do with politics?
Well, I think what we see here is a number of senators, obviously critics of the president, some Republican senators who are retiring, saying that this is about politics and it's about actually a disagreement between the president and Jerome Powell that has been going on for a long time about whether or not to cut interest rates. And this is about the president trying to exert power and say, well, what Jerome Powell is saying, we should just quote him, is basically, this is a dispute about interest rates. This is because I exercised my independent judgment and I made a determination about what to do for interest rates. The president doesn't like it. And now he's announced that or the Department of Justice has announced that there's a federal probe against me. Now, again, I would just say as a lawyer, we have to wait to see what happens in the case. Is there any evidence that would lead a grand jury, if this case is presented to a grand jury, to say there's probable cause of a crime?
All right, Jessica Levinson, we know you'll be watching it closely. It's always great to talk to you. Have a good Monday and a great week ahead.